It Came from New Jersey podcast. Technically, this is episode 3, but this is going to be a different kind of episode that we hope to repeat in the future. We have a guest with us today. His name is Brian Gorsegner. He sings for a band called the Nightbirds, a great New Jersey punk rock band. He also runs Wired Tour Booking and Ancient Artifacts. Brian, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Of course. Bob, how you doing?
I'm good, Pete. Good to join you on this wonderful evening. Brian, thanks for joining us. It's kind of exciting to get on the phone with two people that you've known for over 20 years, and I don't know how often that happens. Not that often for me.
No, I don't know that I've ever done it like a two-way, three-way call like this.
Yeah,
it's fun. You know,
full menage here. So
the Misfits bring people together.
For real. So, Brian, I want you to give a little bit of context for some of the things you work on as an introduction, so people who aren't familiar with you can get more familiar. But we all have known each other for a very long time in the independent music scene in punk and in hardcore music. Your band Nightbirds is definitely one of the best, and actually quite likely to end up on this list on a future episode. So we may have you or maybe another member on, or maybe we'll just have the whole band on to discuss a record at some point. But which would, I think, Pete, that would be a fun concept. What about that?
That would be great. Yeah, absolutely.
But for today, we'll talk Misfits and talk Walk Among Us. Wired Tour Booking is pretty self-explanatory, but I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about that, and Ancient Artifacts, which is kind of an interesting little project that I think probably grew into something more than you thought it would.
Yeah. I started a couple years ago when I lost my full-time regular person job, which was boring, and we don't need to go into that. Right. I was kind of torn between if I wanted to start booking some bands independently, which is something I was doing a little bit on the side already, or try to open a record shop or sell punk rock artifacts and records and T-shirts and things like that through a mail order process. So I did them both for a while. The record thing is called Ancient Artifacts, and the tour booking thing turned into Wired. And kind of just became to realize that, on one, you're totally dependent on finding collections and scoring stuff, and that's kind of what keeps you afloat. And if that doesn't happen, then you're kind of shit out of luck. And I have a 6-year-old daughter, and we have a house, and I have bills to pay. So I was fortunate enough to get some really cool bands, Screaming Females, Off With Their Heads, The Ergs, Radioactivity, bunch of bands. And that kind of started to steamroll. So that was what I decided to focus a lot of my attention on. But I still do Ancient Artifacts just, for fun on the side. It's still a little bit of income to find stuff and sell stuff every now and again. I've been trading tons of records and stuff like that lately. And Nightbirds has been an active band for about 10 years. Been touring and putting out records that entire time.
Wow.
That's kind of back burner now. Everybody's doing real life stuff at the moment, but that's my stuff in a nutshell.
Well, long and the short of it, Nightbirds, as I kind of said, absolutely one of the coolest bands going. I don't think I ever tell you about that, but your records not just hold up, but they feel almost timeless. So that
means a lot.
Huge testament. And Wired Tour Booking, the bands that you mentioned, Screaming Females, The Ergs, Radioactivity, Off With Their Heads, that if there's someone who's listening to this who's a Misfits fan, maybe a lapsed punk or just a music listener in general, I think you'd find something interesting with that group of bands for sure. And on top of that, Ancient Artifacts, for the person out there with a dusty record collection that you think maybe is interesting, we'll try to make sure you can get in touch with Brian. Look him up on all the socials and all that fun stuff.
Yeah.
Pete, kick us off here.
So, as you guys mentioned, we've all known each other for over 20 years at this point, a very long time. We all grew up in New Jersey, and we all grew up going to punk shows. In fact, we all met each other, I think, through going to punk shows.
For sure.
Yeah, definitely.
So, one of the early bands that Bob and I got into was the Misfits, and we covered that on the last episode. We covered Walk Among Us. So we were thinking to ourselves who we could have on the program to talk about Walk Among Us and the Misfits, even further. And Brian came up because, we've known Brian for a long time. He's been involved with punk for a very long time. And, I have to imagine he's a big fan of the Misfits.
I am. That is correct.
Right. So that was kind of the impetus for all this. And I think the point of the episode here is to, really just elaborate more on kind of where we went last episode, but, with another voice in the room, another very educated voice in the room, so again, really excited for this episode. And, this is something we hope to repeat in future episodes, about different records, but Brian's here to help us kick off this kind of segment of the program.
Yeah, the extension of, we'll call it, because I see, you had introed the episode, and it's episode 3, part 2, maybe. We'll see.
Yeah.
3.5, something like that.
Yeah.
So Brian, tell us, what was your first experience, if you remember, with the Misfits?
I do. My first teenage band cover what the hell did we cover? My friend John Brange was a huge Misfits fan, and I remember before I could drive going to like some real sketchy tattoo shop in New Jersey so he could get the Crimson Ghost tattooed on his arm. And then we started doing a band together, and one of the first covers we did was Astro Zombies, and he made me a tape that had Astro Zombies on it, and it's just something that he would very regularly play. Mostly later, by later I mean like Static Age stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But even around that time, I think like the reunion albums were coming out. He was very heavily playing that stuff. I think like the later singles and stuff, it wasn't until I got the box set that I kind of went backwards and discovered that stuff. But yeah, that was my intro to it.
When so what do you remember? And I mean, this is kind of one of those like early stages of punk thing, but what was the difference to you was there a difference to you rather with the Misfits and some of the other bands you were kind of getting into at the time, or were they kind of just part of a group?
I think it was a little bit more, it fit in a little bit better with the stuff that I was listening to at that time, maybe because like, the Addicts had like kind of a goofy clown logo, and they had a bit like of a gimmick. And even like, one-off UK82 stuff like The Exploited, like all, Mohawks, and they kind of had a gimmick. And I didn't, I got into that stuff before I got into a lot of the more meat and potatoes hardcore stuff that I think, Misfits sort of aligned themselves with in that time period, like the Necros and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think had I gotten into, Necros and Negative Approach, Misfits would have been total freaks with like, nobody else was doing what they were doing in that time and place. But because I was already listening to like more gimmicky stuff, I think it fit in maybe a little bit better.
Mm-hmm.
So no, it didn't strike me as that odd when I like, their whole deal. It kind of just flowed with the other stuff I was doing.
Brian, I have a question about, when your first band covered the Misfits, do you remember any other bands that you may have covered around that time? And I asked that only because one of my first bands, I think probably the first full song I ever played actually was Astro Zombies with a few friends.
That's awesome.
And the reason we did it was because we listened to a lot of, we were listening to a lot of punk bands, I guess, at the time. But the only one that we really felt that we could adequately play, given our like abilities at the time, was the Misfits. So I'm wondering, if there were other bands that you were considering covering that maybe, you didn't have the chops. Like, it just seems, one of the things we talked about in the last episode was how the Misfits, like, they write fantastic songs, and like, we'll get into all of this, but the chops in a lot of ways, like, weren't necessarily there all the time. Right. So, I'm wondering how much of an influence that was on like you guys deciding to cover them.
It really wasn't, I don't think, because that band was actually very competent musically. I really just think it was because the one dude in the band, it was very clearly his favorite band. Because other stuff we were covering was like Oi Polloi and like stuff that wasn't like easy to play. It wasn't like Ramon covers and Misfits covers. It was other like pretty technical stuff. But yeah, I mean, it was definitely, we were able to pick up. I think we did it justice pretty well because it was like there's really not much to this song. Like we can probably knock this out,
right?
But I do totally see your point. But it's also kind of like, trying to do a Minor Threat cover when you're a teenager and being like, oh, this is going to be easy. And it's like the nuances of a band like the Misfits that it's really kind of tough to do that stuff well and correct, because it's like, it's the gnarliness of it, I think, that makes it sound so unique. I mean, if another band recorded Walk Among Us, it could easily sound like a pop punk record or something like that.
For sure.
But it's like all the layers that make up the Misfits doing that record that makes it like, pretty ferocious.
So I want to put a pin on that because I want to talk more about the sound, because I had that exact thought listening to All Hell Breaks Loose today. I was like, man, there's so much snarl and attitude on this track, and it's awesome. And there's so few punk bands who capture that. And this might not even be in my top 10 or 15 Misfit songs, and that's crazy. You hit a point, Brian, that I thought was really cool, just kind of casually, and Pete, you reiterated it, and you said before you were driving, before you had your license here in New Jersey, for most of us that's 17, right? Even way back when, right? But that brings to me the idea of like the Misfits being an early band, a formative band for so many people, especially in our age range. Was that ability to play their songs? And you said you were able to play it. You were doing different songs. You're doing a lot of stuff that was not as easy. Do you think that helped people get into it? Pete made a point last episode and again kind of here, where it's like, oh, I heard it and was like, I can do this. Do you think that plays a role in their importance to a kid getting into punk music or music in general?
Yeah, I mean, I would have to imagine, I think that goes for, again, a lot of bands. You hear like the simplicity of it and it makes you want to go out and start your own band. And I think just naturally, because the Misfits were on the top of the heap, I'm sure that that's extremely appealing to a ton of teenagers that, want to go out and start doing something, even like to, start playing drums or start playing guitar. You can just listen to those songs and be like, okay, I can play that drum beat, or I can play that really simple fill. I mean, one of the funnest things, one of the first things I learned how to play on guitar was the 138 guitar solo, the one note wailing solo. And that's something that over years still, I mean, Nightbirds will be like, we need like a 138 solo here. We just need one note to kind of hover over this entire chorus. It gives it so much texture and flavor. It's so cool. But it's so goddamn stupid. I mean, it's like, it's dumb as hell. Who else then was just playing one note guitar solos? It's ridiculous.
Well, and so to me, this is kind of continue off that, because I agree. It's like, what? How did they do this? But the energy pushes it over. For both of you guys, are Misfit songs fun songs to play? Because they seem simple, but there's a lot of energy in them. So are they fun songs to do covers of? And I mean, obviously live reaction or whatever, but are they fun songs to just play?
I think so. Yeah, I think they're super, super fun. But again, I think it takes something kind of cool to make them actually sound good. So I'm like kind of scared to do them now. I mean, mostly because of, vocals. Like it really takes somebody with some vocal chops to be able to do what Danzig does, because despite everything, that guy just has an absolutely gifted, crazy voice. But unlike other instruments, like I'll sit in my house and play drums along to Misfits songs like 100%.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so, one of the things we talked about, Bob, in the last episode is just how the recordings sound like they're pushing so hard. Like there's that X factor, there's that energy that Brian mentioned too. Mm-hmm. Like when I was playing those songs as a kid, I remember like I felt like, believe me, the covers definitely did not sound as good as the Misfits, but I felt like I was pushing super hard, which made me feel like, confident in the way that I was sounding. I feel like
Right.
now, if I were to play those songs in front of people, I would be super self conscious about it, kind of like what Brian's talking about. I feel like it would have to be like Halloween show scenario, like we're decked out in like all the clothes, we like do the whole costume thing. Then I would maybe be like, all right, I can get behind this. But like, yeah, I mean, it's hard to find that X factor that they had. So is it fun to play? Yeah, for sure. But like, if I were to do it in front of people, I feel like I would feel a way about it.
I feel that. All right, so let's hone in a little bit and talk about the record Walk Among Us. Brian, I'll pull it back. Brian, you're a Misfits fan. What is your go-to Misfits material? What are some of your favorites? And then we'll eventually get to Walk Among Us, wherever that falls in the overall look at things.
My favorite stuff is definitely the singles. The pre and I love the singles that they did same era as Walk Among Us, Halloween and Night of the Living Dead. But like Bullet and Horror Business, I think are two of the greatest American punk rock EPs ever, or not only American, I mean just all time greatest EPs. I think they're absolutely perfect. I think their production is perfect. It's just incredible pop music, really played.
Yes.
It's perfect. It's absolutely perfect.
So pop music is right. It's really catchy. What separates it? What puts it more in that realm, and why is it not pop music? You know what I mean? Like it is, but it's not. So break that down for us.
I mean, I just think because of the snarl and the gross sound to it all. They're the kind of band that I think could have written Glenn Danzig could have written songs and given them to another band. Even had like the Ramones done some of those Misfits tracks, I think they could be radio quality songs, but they're just so nasty. I mean, like the bass tone, the guitar tone, even the drumming is just very bare bones, stripped down, and the recordings are just straight up nasty sounding.
So I never thought about that. The idea of the Ramones doing the Misfits songs. That's because that's one of the differences. Like if you compare the Ramones and the Misfits, they're both writing pretty simple songs. Nothing crazy. One note solos and such. But the Misfits were dirtier and more aggressive and a lot rougher around the edges than the Ramones. And you're right. Like there are certainly, 5 to 10 Misfit songs that if they were Ramones songs, it feels like they could still be bopping on the radio right now.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to add one caveat to that. And that's that the lyrics are really fucked up. I mean, like I'm surprised the Misfits haven't gotten canceled in 2020, but there's songs that are just like, Jesus Christ, man. Like you read the lyrics to something and you're like, that's deranged. Like I didn't realize, and I don't know the lyrics to a lot of Misfit songs compared to a lot of my favorite bands. You think you know all the words and the song comes on and you're at karaoke and you're like, what the hell are the words to this song that I've known for 20 years?
Right.
And then you read the lyrics and you're like, oh my God, like that is dark.
Sorry.
Yeah.
That's one of the things that came up in the last episode, actually, was just how dark those lyrics were. Like, I'm not sure that would fly at this point. And I had the same experience as you. I think when I listened to Walk Among Us just for this episode, I don't think I'd ever read that lyric sheet before. I really thought that I knew all the lyrics, and then I read through them, and I was like, oh, this is brutal,
Yeah. It's also wildly poetic. I mean, the way that he constructs his lyrics, I think, are really, really brilliant. Mm-hmm. And it's just so well put together, and nobody else does stuff like that. And then, like in that scene, everything else is about fuck school and fuck the government and this and that. But like Glenn's lyrics are, I think, terrific. But when you get into it, you're like, oh my God, the lyrics to Bullet are
we read the lyrics to Bullet. We read the lyrics to Bullet, and I stopped before it got super graphic.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So it's you're totally right. Dead on. Because he was also pulling on themes that nobody else was doing. you know?
Yeah.
And we kind of said that he created this weird Venn diagram where punk music and people who love horror and sci-fi and like cult type stuff intersect. And it's like, well, obviously they're a Misfits fan. You know?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
you got spiky hair and you're at Monster Mania. You probably like the Misfits.
Yeah. Yeah, I would imagine.
Yeah, I mean, and Brian, going off the poetry of it too, I mean, one of the things I thought about was, a lot of the punk bands at the time were like really on the nose, kind of political with their lyrics, whereas the Misfits, like, were not technically political at all, but just the vibe and the feel of those songs, like, it feels apocalyptic, right? So it was like, I don't know, I perceive of it as almost like being political without touching politics in any way,
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I really do think that Danzig is a genius. I mean, a kind of like the Darby Crash of the Germs level, where it's like, all the songs, and you're like, yeah, this is like dumb as hell. Like it doesn't get any more dumbed down, and then you read it, and you're like, whoa, like what the hell was going on here? Just next level, brilliant stuff.
Brilliant stuff,
yeah,
and
pretty twisted.
Yeah, I mean, edgy by today's standards.
Yeah.
Like, and that's something you don't hear very much, the way the time marches, things get a lot harder for people to handle. But these lyrics are really out there, and you're totally right. They're next level. The way they're written and the way they flow in songs is just incredible. And that, I don't know that Danzig gets credit for that. I don't think he gets credit for that in the way that he should in the spheres and the worlds that he's been in, which is more than just punk, but also like metal and rock or whatever you want to consider later era Danzig. What would you compare Glenn Danzig's vocals to?
Like the styling of it, the way it sounds?
The style and sound, yeah.
I don't know. I mean, it's
we hit Elvis, but when you listen to it and really dive in, it's like, yeah, he's taking cues from that, but it's twisted and ugly. It's really nasty. Like it sounds like he's viciously mad at someone who the song's about, but he's singing about a 1960s sci-fi movie. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, I really don't know that I could compare it to anything, to be honest. I think it's really unique. He has an absolutely fantastic voice. It's just, it's great, and it's twisted, and it's very much his own. But the guy can sing, I mean, he could be like a wedding singer if if he wasn't Glenn Danzig.
Have you ever heard him talk?
Yeah.
That's the part that really makes me acknowledge how good of a singer he is, because the speaking voice, it's like, yeah, this is just some dude from North Jersey, man, and he still hasn't lost it, despite the fact I think he's lived in California for 30 years.
Yeah. No, yeah. I mean, it's like, some Sinatra level shit where it's like, this dude is so Jersey, and then he can just absolutely croon. I mean, he can. It's just it's the fact of the matter.
So you prefer the singles. Where do you stand on the albums? Walk Among Us, Earth AD.
Well, this is an interesting, slightly off track, if you don't mind, point. Of
course, please.
That I think is really interesting, specifically to Walk Among Us. Walk Among Us was the third Misfits album, as far as the recording. They had done 12 Hits from Hell, and they did Static Age, neither of which were released at the time. So the first debut, quote unquote, album was Walk Among Us. But like, that was their third album, which is absolutely insane. And I think it sounds like that, because I think it sounds closer to Earth AD in overall vibe than it does the early singles. But as far as where it stands for me, I absolutely love it. I think it could be a different band than the band on the singles and would still make my top 10.
So I think that's a great point that we didn't hit. We talked about how there were the previous album recordings, but Pete, what do you Walk Among Us? It doesn't come off like a band's first album, which makes sense, because not only had it's sort of this thing that will happen if a band records a lot of singles, but then finally puts together an album, sometimes it can work really well. Walk Among Us feels like a fully formed concept, and like it really kind of flows and works pretty well together. And knowing, putting together the history and lost pieces where it's like, oh, actually they had recorded 2 full albums before this, they just never saw light of day till much later. Does that kind of all fit to you?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, we talked about it a little bit in the last episode, but this album, from what I know, it was recorded. I think the majority of it was recorded in one place, and then there were a few tracks recorded elsewhere, and then there's a live track. So to me, in a way, it does feel like, the band and the way that they play definitely sounds like they've been, playing for a while. The record itself, although I think it's like a near perfect record, it is interesting that like they would include a live track and not have one session. Brian, actually, that's a good point. Do you know why there's a live track?
There's so much that I find weird about this album,
right.
And that is definitely a huge part of it. I have no idea. I mean, the fact that they record, most bands that we would think of from back then would be like, and then we went into this guy's basement in a weekend and we recorded everything in 20 hours. But this was a record that was recorded over multiple locations, live, a live track. I have absolutely no idea. It's totally unnecessary.
I mean, our guess was that it just, maybe captured the energy in a way that they were happy with and just went for that over the recorded version or something like that. But
yeah, there's no way it wasn't a strategic, very thought out move, because that's not the way that they ever operated. So it's there for a reason, but
right.
I couldn't tell you why.
So okay, you love Walk Among Us, different than singles. Let's talk about a little bit the difference between the singles and Walk Among Us, and what you think that is sonically, or is it just the fact that it's the difference between when a band writes singles and it's like, hey, here's a solid A side and here's a solid B side, and now, hey, we're writing a whole album?
No, I will say it's absolutely not that, and here's why. There's no bad songs on Walk Among Us. There's almost no bad Misfits songs.
Really close, really tough to think of ones. I mean, Brain Eaters was our only argument that it's not, and I think I said I appreciated that it was on there. Pete was a little more iffy, but that might be one of the ones that's like, it's not in the top 40. We'll say that.
But you know what's weird? It was one of my favorites when I was 14 or 15.
We said that amateur juvenile kind of feel to it, I think, was very intentional and thought out. And that it's kind of like,
it's almost nursery rhyme-ish, where like you can like any kind of music and you just hear it and it just sounds like some stupid ass schoolyard song. In retrospect, it's kind of a dud, but I do think it definitely served a purpose when I was that age. But really, like Astro Zombies definitely could have been a 1979 7-inch, and it could have easily had other songs. It could have had Violent World on the B-side. Any of those songs I think could have been singles. Something I think that, and again, this is what makes it different for me, and I guess maybe is why I don't like it quite as much as the early stuff. I do think because around this time they were just heavily playing with all the hardcore bands, specifically the Midwest stuff, and they had Googie playing drums.
Yep.
I do think it was just overall a more hardcore band than it was early on, when it was definitely just more of a North Jersey, New York City punk rock band. And I think it was a little bit more melodic, a little bit more stripped down, and I think it just started to get a little bit heavier, just a little bit more bass driven by 81, 82-ish. And I just tend to like the boppier punk stuff. Like I said, even if this was a different band, it would still end up in my top 10. But it definitely started getting more hardcore.
Yeah, no, the speed starts to pick up, and that's where we're kind of on the road to Earth AD. And for perhaps the uninformed listener, if you listen to the earliest, well, not the earliest, but even the earliest Misfits stuff, there's a much more mid-tempo, not even a gallop, we'll call it a trot. How about that? Drum beat, and it really kind of stays in the pocket. And as you move into Walk Among Us, it gets faster. But by Earth AD, they're on a borderline thrashing speed. They go really fast there. So some of the things that you hear them hinting at on Walk Among Us come to roost on Earth AD, and you're totally right. Why do you think that was? Because I think you're right. The Misfits early material does feel like a northern New Jersey, New York City punk rock band, but it feels like they almost never fit in, or at least didn't break into the scene there. Which, if you look at the historic placement for the Misfits, and you can speak on this maybe, they hit at a time when New York City's kind of going through the transition, which that early 76-ish range of things, CBGBs, is starting to fade, and the new New York City hardcore thing isn't really kicking off. So the Misfits almost don't have anyone to play with in that world. Do you think that's accurate, or do you have a different view on that?
Yeah, I mean, my gut was just kind of, because the thing is, like, I couldn't really picture that era Glenn Danzig like necessarily even like liking the Necros, and I could be completely wrong about that. I have absolutely no idea, but I kind of feel like it was the other guys in the band, and maybe they had found an audience that actually liked them, because anybody I know from back then that actually saw the Misfits, like, nobody really cared about them in the late 70s, kind of thought they sucked. And I think it just happened to work out where when they toured out west, everybody out there just totally ate it up. And they befriended all of those bands. And I think it was just kind of where they found a home more than anything else. I'm curious. I really wonder how much, like, did Glenn Danzig own a copy of the Negative Approach 7-inch?
Right. It's a worthwhile question. I mean, I bet so, but perhaps more in the way, dear Glenn, we love your band. Here's my band's 7-inch. Check it out. Yeah. Highlight the words "check it out" by John Brannon.
Yes.
So, yeah, it's so fascinating to me, because you're right. We've more than once associated them with sonically with things that they weren't, which is, yes, if you listen to the early singles, it makes sense. Like, could they have played with the Ramones? Of course they could. Of course they fucking could. Could they have? But the Ramones were almost, certainly too big, unless the Misfits were doing some weird opening slot thing to play with them. I wouldn't even be.
I don't know how much they did that.
No, playing with the Damned or Dead Boys, yeah, clearly, like that sonically, they register a lot more over there. But I don't think they ended up with a lot of those bands too often. But then they get almost adopted by the early first wave American hardcore scene, and that's where it seems like they had a home. And there is, there's a slight thing where I think about, do you think there was an element of, these are the people who love us, cool, oh, they've got bands, oh, that's pretty cool too, and appreciating those who appreciate you the most?
That's what my gut says, just because even the early shows, most of the flyers I see, it would be shows that they're headlining with, like, the Victims, who was like members at one point or another of their own band whose record they released, like stuff like that, where it seems like their own curated thing, where they probably called Max's and was like, hey, we want to come down and headline or something, and sent them a record that was on the jukebox, and they were like, all right. But yeah, you're right. Like, I could be wrong, but I don't think the Misfits and the Ramones ever shared a stage, which is pretty crazy. But Misfits were just very much their own entity, and I don't know if that was because they didn't want to be a part of something, or they didn't know how to necessarily be a part of it, because maybe they weren't, like guys from the scene who were necessarily, they weren't doing scenes or doing zines or putting on shows or things like that.
Yeah.
So it might have just been like kind of doing their own thing. And then when they toured, the only natural thing to do was to play in these already established scenes. And then they meet these people, and, I don't know. Obviously, all those people ate it up. And back home, they totally had like, hometown band syndrome, where it was like people just didn't seem to care.
Right. Which is so wild, because I think now them being from New Jersey has become almost part of their signature, right? Like that matters. Do you know when their earliest tours were? Because to my memory, they didn't tour much early. They weren't touring on those singles. If I'm remembering correctly, I might be totally ignorant to it.
I'm not totally sure.
I feel like the first time I start seeing them do out of town stuff is post 1980. We're looking at like 81, 82 ish kind of. And what you said, where they're playing established scenes, it's like, yeah, the Misfits were putting out records early, but it didn't seem like they were getting out there. But then once bands were getting out there, like, oh, let's go do this.
Well, I mean, they must have, I'm not exactly sure, but I do know that they went to London in like 78 or 79 when Horror Business came out.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Because there was that whole story within the last couple of years where they had shipped a box of Horror Business singles to a guy in England because they were going out there to do shows. They got out there, they did one show, they got arrested, and that's, they ended up writing London Dungeon about that. So they were traveling overseas in the late 70s, so they must have been, I can only imagine, unless, I don't know the details of that trip. I don't know. That's a good question.
Okay, here we go. Thank you, Internet, because I was like, you know what? We all love the Misfits, Pete, but none of us are this level of crazy. And I was like, with the Misfits, there's definitely people who are listening to this screaming at their thing like, no, you idiots. 77, they play 3 shows. No. They have it. Oh my God. This is broken down by the lineup. So they're touring around. They make it up to Toronto and play with the Skulls. They open with the Victims. They play with the Victims in New York, New Jersey.
When is this? This is
77. So 77, they're actually playing lots of local shows. But they, as early as 78, they make it out to Detroit.
Okay.
Back to Toronto again. So they must have had a hookup there. Someone loved that. I'm sure we can get some good stories on that. 78, a lot of New York shows, but it's, if they're playing 10 shows and they're doing these really funny sets, this is incredible, guys. You both love this. I'll send you it on Misfits Central. They have a full lineup of the shows the Misfits played, but they're doing things where it's like essentially 2 shows at Max's Kansas City with the Flash Cubes, and then they're playing Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, back to back, and then they're playing the same venue in Bethlehem later on that year, 4 shows in a row. You know what I mean? Right. Yeah. Like 4 days in a row. Like, so they're doing, and they did have a UK tour opening for the Damned in 79, and they only played 2 shows, and then the rest was canceled because of said situation.
Yeah. Do we know why they were arrested? Do we know that piece of history?
I don't know exactly.
So they get, in the U.S., up until 1980, they get out to Detroit once, and otherwise it's, they get to Toronto, and otherwise it's New York, New Jersey, and some Pennsylvania, like Philadelphia and Lehigh Valley dates. Post 1980, that's the first time they start doing like strings. They make it to Chicago in 81. And then in 81, they fly out to California, it looks like, or whatever, drive out, who knows. And they play a string of shows. They play 3 shows in California, 2 in San Fran, and 1 down in Costa Mesa. And that's that. That was it. Then the Walk Among Us tour is the first, we'll say, tour, because they do a few shows in DC, do the Northeast, then head out, and it looks like they drive across, and there looks like there's some holes here, but they do a full U.S. tour on Walk Among Us, which is interesting. And then things start clicking ahead, where they do an Eva Live tour, Earth AD. So this is actually fascinating. And then do the farewell show in 83 with the Necros in Detroit. So in a long, convoluted way, they don't do significant touring other than making it out to Toronto and Detroit and flying out to London, because it makes sense. Oh, the Damned are having us come play with them. Okay, cool. And it does show you how weird and little this scene is. But the best question that's been asked is, the Ramones and the Misfits never shared the stage. That's fascinating.
Yeah. But again, it's like that total hometown band syndrome, where maybe by the time they would have had enough momentum to do that, they had already played like over and over and over again, and people had already seen them suck over and over and over again.
Right.
So, in the UK, like I can say that for my own band. When we go play Chicago or we play London or we play California, it's always better than our hometown shows. And I think it's just, you get out of town and people don't know, and they're all totally excited, and everybody makes it out to those shows. So it sounds pretty organic. I mean, the way that they started pretty much doing everything, going from having absolutely no idea how to do shit to, that just sounds like anybody's first band, really.
For sure. But as first bands go, the Misfits are a pretty good one. I'd say they had a lasting impact.
Yeah.
Talking more specifically about Walk Among Us, favorite track. This is something we didn't do. So, Pete, what's your favorite track as well?
I think, it's funny. I brought up the Mommy, Can I Go Out and Kill Tonight and how it's a live track before. I think that might be my favorite track. I remember that had a huge impact on me when I was a kid. It was like one of the fastest tracks, if not the fastest track on the album. And I wanted more of that. Like it just felt so aggressive, when they actually kick into the fast part. I don't know. I don't even know if that's a hot take or a bold statement, but I think that's how I feel.
I'd say that's a pretty hot take.
Yeah, I think the cold take is that Skulls is my favorite song on the record. Because it's like, yeah, that's a pretty good one. People know that one. All Hell Breaks Loose is in the running. Yeah, I think that's probably my top. 20 Eyes and I Turned Into a Martian is such a strong way to start the record. I just love the way you're kind of dropped into 20 Eyes. It sets the tone in that way that like, oh, okay, we're going here.
Yeah, it's going to be a relentless 25 minutes or however long it is.
Exactly.
Yeah, those two, the opening two, but in reverse order. I Turned Into a Martian and 20 Eyes.
Yeah.
Probably are my favorites. I don't know, but even listening to it today after having not heard it for a little while, Violent World, there's just tracks on it, I'm like, oh yeah, God, this is awesome.
Violent World has one of the parts that just gets in my head, that do do do, like the deep part, that'll just get in my head randomly at times, and becomes one of those silent soundtracks to your life kind of thing when some bad shit's happening, that's going through my head.
Man, it stinks that they closed with the stinkiest track.
That's right.
Well, yeah, and that's my point. I just feel like Astro Zombies would be even function as a great closer track. You can just keep the whole record so hot.
And I could have just nixed it. It would have been so easy.
It would have been so easy.
So if there was anything you would is there anything you would change on this record? We've acknowledged we all we put the caveat, we're all gigantic fans and not just but love this record. So with that respect in mind, is there anything you would change or take off?
I'd get rid of the last song on side A and the last song on side B.
Oh, so that's the conversation we had.
And Brain Eaters can both take a hike.
Now, is it because it's a live track or because you just don't like the track?
I like it in theory, but just a live song in the middle of an album, I can't wrap my head around that.
Yeah, I feel you. On paper and in theory, I totally feel you, but I don't know. Maybe it's just one of those albums I've heard enough that it doesn't bother me anymore. I don't know. I like it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I came to the conclusion that I like it. And I like the energy. I also said that it's purely for these weird aesthetic reasons that I'm sure they were, like you said, conscious of. It just comes across. It brings an energy that I don't think would be there. And even though it almost feels juvenile to do something like throw a live track in the middle of a record, it separates it a bit. It gives it this kind of different feeling. How do you feel about the production of Walk Among Us?
I like it a little bit less than the singles. Again, I think it was getting a little bit just heavier and more bass heavy. Googie's drumming, I think. I really think it's the drumming is the biggest element to me that I like the earlier stuff. But But yeah, I think it just overall gets a little bit heavier. And again, love it, but I prefer the sound of anything before it.
If you had never heard the album, by looking at it, and you'd never heard the Misfits, what would you think it sounded like looking at it?
That's a good question. I have absolutely no idea. I'll let Pete go first.
No, I mean, well, so this is one of the things we touched on last episode, and what we talked about was in 2020, looking at this album cover. I mean, first of all, yeah, it's a tough question because it's really hard to separate yourself from an album that you've been familiar with for so long. But there are bands that have existed since. Like any number of kind of goth bands, or like different kinds of punk bands, or like Type O Negative, or whoever it might be. We mentioned last episode. It's tough because I feel like in a lot of ways it could look like a lot of different genre album covers. Obviously it doesn't sound. It sounds like what it sounds like, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at it now because I thought that this was a video conference we were having, so I came prepared. My copy is also still in the shrink, first press, still in the shrink.
Ooh, flex.
Very nice. Two things come to mind. One, if I was like 14 at the record shop, I would probably think it was like a soundtrack because the logo is very Munsters-esque at this point. I also prefer the earlier logo.
Yes.
I will say, comparatively speaking, this was probably their wackest artwork up to this point. And I love the cover to this record, but the singles, I think, have some of the coolest punk rock artwork ever. I think all of them are very aesthetically pleasing for all different reasons. I think Glenn had a really good eye for that kind of stuff. I wonder if there's somebody that put the art together for this that wasn't him.
That's a good question. I mean, when did they first use the new Misfits logo? Is it here?
I don't know. I would have to imagine it was probably before this. Yeah, it was definitely before this, but I would have to cheat to find out when they actually started using it.
Same, right. They were using kind of this more... It looked more hand done, and I'd be shocked if the newer Misfits logo wasn't hand done. So I'm sure it was as well. But the earlier version is a little bit more rough, less cartoony, like less pulpy. We'll say that.
Yeah. I'm cheating. But.
Is this? Yeah, Pete. While he's looking, is this might be the worst Misfits record art?
I think it is. Yeah. I mean, when you really think about it, the early singles cover, like Brian said, it's great. It's like perfect punk rock artwork. And even the later album covers, I think are a little better than this. This one, like, I like it a lot. It looks great. I've been familiar with it for so long. I guess it's hard to separate at this point, but it does look a little bit thrown together. It's like they obviously took some things from, old horror movie posters.
Yep.
Cut that shot out of them, put it on there. Like it doesn't look slapped together, but
I'll ask this:
doesn't look like as much thought went into it as other album covers for sure.
I'll ask this: if you make it a single tone, if you make that all black and white, I think it might look pretty sharp. There's just a lot going on, so the layers of it, when you add in the colors, it's tough. And also, you know what? The Misfits logo throws it off as well because it almost has a more serious tone, which some of the early singles do too. But when you throw the logo on it, it starts to feel like artwork stew, and not all the ingredients fit together well.
Yeah, so that logo really, unless it was on a shirt, it didn't happen until the 80s. And I think they did Halloween during these sessions. At some point during the Walk Among Us sessions, I think is when they recorded Halloween. Halloween definitely has the new Munsters logo. So does Evil Live. So does Die Die My Darling.
Die Die My Darling might be my least favorite art of the Misfits, even though it's probably structurally cooler and just as iconic, and probably more iconic than Walk Among Us.
By 84, I think they were just using like lamer art techniques. Like everything before that was probably hand done by Glenn. At that point, it's definitely like a font. Like Die Die My Darling is like icicle font or some whack shit. I must tell you though, I'm looking at the inner sleeve for this record, and there's so much weird, cool stuff that I wish one of those guys was here with us to ask. First off, there's definitely a picture with them with Barry Hensler from the Necros, yep. What looks to be Harley Flanagan, and maybe John Brennan. I don't know who that guy is.
Oh yeah, I'm looking at it now. The one where they're holding up the records. That's definitely Harley.
Yep. The Necros holding up IQ32.
Yep. That's a cool photo, and that could be Brandon for sure.
Is that Harley?
That's definitely Harley. 100%, it's Harley.
What? So that must have been. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, I mean that dude was around and was buddies with the Misfits, which is kind of funny.
Yeah.
So talking more about Walk Among Us, I mean we've kind of circled around it. Any other sonic things that really stand out to you?
I don't know. No, I mean I think it still has the same grit, riddled in distortion. As the singles, I would really have to listen to stuff back to back to see what it is that personally I prefer more. It could just be a matter of mixing or something like that. I just think it's a little too bassy and rumbly and not as like, I guess just trebly and distorted. It's just heavier. There's so many credits on this thing. It was recorded all over the place, mixed in California. I don't know. I think there might have just been too many maybe cooks in the kitchen or something like that when putting it together. It just doesn't have the same, to me, it doesn't have the same rawness that some of the earlier stuff has.
Sure.
Bob, did you have anything more about Walk Among Us specifically?
No, I think the last thing I wanted to let you pose, because this was your thought, was about the Misfits more broadly in the current times.
Yeah, I was going to say we could probably start winding down, but Brian, one of the things that we talked about in the last episode is really, I got into punk through the Misfits. Obviously they played a huge part for the two of you as well. We got into a discussion really about whether or not the Misfits are a gateway band in 2020. Meaning, are kids still now hearing the Misfits early on, and are the Misfits kind of getting them into, deeper into punk rock or deeper into, other kind of subcultural categories? Do you think kids are, or do you think they're not?
Are kids getting into punk, period? I would say first. And I don't know that they are so much. I would have to assume to some degree they're still as influential as they ever were. But I don't know. There's not as much shock and allure to a band like the Misfits as there would have been, I think, when we got into that stuff. Just because a lot has, come since then. And I think that was a big part of it when kids are getting into it. It's so freaky and weird, and it looks weird, and it sounds weird, and it's exciting. But again, they were the gateway for a ton more bands that came after them that got considerably more popular for them.
Right.
So if anything, bands like Metallica, or even, I would use Marilyn Manson as an example, but I don't know if kids are getting into Marilyn Manson either. I don't know what current day thing is maybe getting the attention that the Misfits deserve from the youth, but I don't know. It's an interesting question.
Yeah, that's one of the things we talked about too. it seems like to me, culturally, they've definitely had, a really clear impact. Like you said, Marilyn Manson, Metallica, all these bands. And I think like aesthetically, there's still a clear influence and all of that, but it's just so baked in at this point that it's hard to, kind of break it apart.
Yeah, I don't know. We need kids. What do kids like?
So with that, Brian, would it be safe to say you heard or had or were very aware of Walk Among Us in 1997?
Probably 1998.
Okay, 1998. Walk Among Us came out in 1982 or 83? I'm trying to remember.
82. It was recorded in 81.
So 82. So that's 16 years. So we are now further from the point where you heard it, we all heard it, say, then we're further from that point, our point of discovery, than we were when we first heard it. You know what I mean?
That's weird.
It's really weird. And so that's something I think about generationally in subculture music. And we, with it came from New Jersey, our plan is to do all kinds of music from New Jersey. So hopefully someone who's hearing this, when we talk about certain old records, some people don't look at a Bruce Springsteen record and wonder like, oh, this came out in 1979. Oh, that was so long ago. But some people do. And I can always understand someone not understanding something. Like there are people who love the Misfits who were born after we heard the Misfits, for sure. But I always think about it because when I listen to Walk Among Us, I still feel that vitality. I still feel energy from it in a way that I think resonates with young people all the time. I think there's still, and I hope, and if there isn't, boy, that would be really sad. But I think there's still people who can't drive who are going with their friend to get a Crimson Ghost tattoo. You know what I mean? So,
yeah, I hope so. I hope so as well. I think that would be a beautiful thing.
Right, Pete, anything else, my friend?
Brian, have you ever been to Lodi?
I've never been to Lodi.
All right, group road trip.
Yeah, you can join us. We talked about this. Neither of us has ever been to Lodi either. And I think I've only known one person from Lodi. So if anyone from Lodi hears this, we need some recommendations. Preferably pizza is pretty high on my list. Anything else that we should check out in Lodi, and we'll report back hopefully in the future. And Brian, we expect you now to join us on this journey, this pilgrimage to Mecca.
I would very much love to. Misfits being from Jersey, because also by all accounts, like, and I mean this in the absolute nicest way, but like, from what I hear, they were really just like Jersey bozos, just total like Italian Jersey, North Jersey guys. And obviously I love that and I can relate to it, but
sure.
I feel like they were more, and again, I don't know. I think I find them really interesting, but I feel like they were more like Jersey than they are punks, if anything. I'm really curious as to what their tie was to the scene, like what bands they liked, if they liked anything, or if that was just like their playing ability. I don't know. I've always been really curious about that. And like, did Glenn own the self-titled Ramones album? Like, one would assume, like, I have no idea. Yeah. Wouldn't that be weird, like Glenn listening to the first Ramones record? I don't know why I find that kind of bizarre.
Yeah, but it almost feels like he had to, but then you think it through and you think maybe not. Like, they could have been this weird island, but then you see, like, okay, they flew to London to play with the Damned, so they were aware of them, and they were playing these shows with different bands. So there were some connections, and they did do this DIY, putting out their own records, so they were figuring out networking. But yeah, like, here's the other thing that we circled around a bit. It doesn't feel like the Misfits, much like, early wave punk bands, there wasn't this total adherence to the idea of like, nah, man, we're DIY. We don't want any big businesses involved, and as can be seen by Glenn's later projects, like, that dude signed to the biggest label he could and would go play arenas tomorrow if he could. They didn't have any compunction with that. So there wasn't that sort of subculture ethics either. It was just like, oh, this is who wants us to play? Cool. Where are we going to play? VFW? Cool. Oh, we're not playing Tiger Stadium? All right, that's fine, you know?
Yeah, no, I mean, and the first album, Walk Among Us is on Slash. It's on a big label at the time. So I can only feel that, again, it's just very organic in the way where they were like, okay, I guess we're just going to put out our own records. Okay, I guess we're just going to go play Toronto and not play anything on the way because, like, somebody asked us to play there. Like, it just seems so clueless and organic and cool. And in my head, I think that's why I could picture them more being like a part of Tony Soprano's crew than I can like guys that would go see the Ramones when they played North Jersey. And then it was just kind of like wanting to do, it just seemed like they started a company more than anything, like from the t-shirts and their own mail order.
Yeah.
It's more like this than it was anything else. But, and I have that same feeling about like, I can't picture Johnny Ramone purchasing an album either. Like those guys were just very much doing their own thing. And if they couldn't be on the top of the bill, then they wanted no part of it. I don't know. It's interesting because that's just not the way that things work anymore or have for a long time. But I think, the truest genius freaks were just all about just doing stuff and getting done, not waiting around for a record deal or trying to be part of a scene. Like they were just doing their thing. It's crazy.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. They kind of did their thing and, other worlds or scenes kind of gravitated to them than the other way, And I think that's kind of a cool place. And certainly Walk Among Us fits into this tapestry of punk at large. But maybe that isolates why we've talked about the Misfits and they sort of stand out even in this world that's supposed to be diverse and all these different things. And, the Misfits stood out in a weird way, even in punk rock music.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. A lot of other stuff you can just lump together with a particular scene or a time. And, you might not be able to talk about the big boys without talking about the Dicks or MDC or whatever else was going on in Texas at that point. But like, yeah, the Misfits are a beast all in their own. And it seems like everybody at the time really recognized it too. Like even when they went through Texas and they would play with the big boys, like everybody was a fan. It just seemed like as soon as they got out of town, everybody loved the Misfits and they were like their own beast, a force to be reckoned with.
Cool. I think that's a good place to end it.
Absolutely.
What do you guys think? Anything else?
No, I think that's great. Brian, thank you so much for joining us today. That was great. We look forward to, maybe we'll have you on again. That was a really fun conversation.
Yeah, I love you guys. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
No, of course. Brian, is there anything you want to plug before we go?
Nah.
Check out Ancient Artifacts, check out Wired Touring, and of course, check out the Mighty Nightbirds.
That works.
Great. Thanks, guys.